Chapter 11 is on appraising. As I mentioned earlier, the real estate licensee is prohibited from doing appraisals. Any appraisal that's done today has to be done by someone who's state certified. As far as the value conclusions that come up, or the values that an appraiser has to come up with, there are several. To begin with, there's the investment value. That's what a property's worth if it was producing income. Assessed value, liquidation value, salvage value, incurable value is another. But the most common type of value that the appraiser is looking for is called market value. And the easiest way to remember market value, what's the average person under average and normal conditions willing to pay for a property? And there are several things that we look at, or the appraiser looks at, when they're trying to make that determination. Are both the buyer and seller motivated under normal conditions? Both parties are well informed about the property and well advised about it? A reasonable amount of time has been allotted to do research. Payment is made in US dollars. And the price represents an arm's length transaction. And let me explain what arm's length transaction means. That means the buyer is dealing for the buyer's best interest and the seller is dealing for the seller's best interest. If a mom and dad is selling a house to a son or a daughter, that's typically not considered to be an arm's length transaction. Some concepts that you need to know and be familiar with and know the difference between the concept of cost, price, and value. Cost is what it takes to create a particular property. Value is what we think it's worth. It's an imaginary number, if you will. Price is what somebody actually pays for a property. I think it's important to note that in a normal market, these three things may be similar, but it's also important for you to understand that one will not create the other. Just because it costs you a certain amount of money to build a home doesn't mean that somebody's going to be willing to pay it. As far as the characteristics of value are concerned, there are four. First, there has to be demand. That is, somebody's got to want it. Secondly, there's got to be utility. That is, you've got to be able to use it for something. A home we live in, a commercial property we work in. Thirdly, there's got to be scarcity. Scarcity is that supply side. Remember, we talked about supply and demand. And lastly, in real estate, there's got to be transferability. In other words, you've got to be able to transfer title for it to have any kind of value. The acronym is DUST. There are several principles that appraisers have to use when trying to determine value. One of the basic principles is the principle of substitution. And I want you to think about the principle of substitution. First of all, it does set the upper limits of value. And what it's basically saying is that why would you want to pay a certain amount of money for a property if there's another one just like it for less money? Or better yet, why would you be willing to pay a certain amount of money if everybody else is willing to pay less? That's the principle of substitution. Also, the increasing and decreasing returns. And what we're talking about there is diminishing returns. Over improvements. Sometimes we do things to properties that over improve them. For instance, studies have been out. Anytime that we paint a home or we do landscaping, we're going to make money on it. But anytime you do major renovations of bathrooms and kitchens, typically you're not going to get all your money back. A swimming pool is a good example of an over improvement. You may pay $25,000 for it, but I promise you it's not going to appraise out for that. The appraiser is going to give it less value than that. The principle of conformity, which simply says that properties in a neighborhood should be similar with each other. This protects property values. Now, there's a concept that I want you to know and understand the difference. Assemblage and plottage. Assemblage is the combining of two or more parcels of real estate under one ownership. Plottage is the increased value because of that assemblage. And let me give you a good example. I was asked by a developer in the Pensacola area to find some land to build a medical complex on. And I found 11 different parcels of real estate. At closing, we brought them all under one ownership. We paid about $1.25 a square foot when we bought it. After we did our development plan, our site plan, and went in and got ready to get our loan, we had it reappraised. And with the new project that we're putting on there, that land appraised out for about $3 a square foot. Because of assemblage, because of combining those lots under one ownership and the way that we were going to develop it, that land went up in value. That increase in value is known as plottage. Now, the appraiser is going to be required to do 3 approaches to find value if at all possible. Those 3 approaches are the comparable sales approach, the cost depreciation approach, and the income approach. So let's start first of all with the comparable sales approach. The comparable sales approach is based on the principle of substitution. We rely very heavily on the comparable sales approach when we're dealing with residential properties, vacant land, and small income producing properties. And basically what we're doing here is we're simply comparing other properties that have sold. So the first thing that we want to do in the comparable sales approach is collect data. We want to collect as many comparables as we can that are similar to our subject property. And that is, they need to be the same construction quality, same bedroom, same baths, same everything if at all possible. We know that that's not always possible, so what we have to do is make adjustments. So once we have gathered our comparables, the next thing we want to do is adjust those comparables and make them like our subject. We cannot adjust the subject property. That's important for you to remember. You can only adjust comparables. And I want you to remember the concept of Robin Hood. Robin Hood says, take from the rich and give to the poor. So let's do that. If a comparable is superior to our subject property, it's better than, if you will, richer than. We're going to take away from it and make it like our subject property. If that comparable is inferior and not as good as our subject property, then we're going to have to add whatever we have to add to it to make it like our subject property. Remember Robin Hood, take from the rich and give to the poor, and that should give us a pretty close value to what our subject property is worth. The cost depreciation approach, on the other hand, is not using comparables. The cost depreciation approach is simply, first of all, based on the principle of substitution, but we rely very heavily on the cost approach when we're doing special purpose buildings that may not have comparables, those churches or courthouses or things of that nature. What we're doing with the cost approach is that we're going to take that exact structure just like it's sitting, and we're going to build it as though it's brand new today, whatever that new construction cost is. Then we're going to subtract away whatever depreciation has occurred on the property. Now, as far as trying to determine what the reproduction cost is, the most common is the unit comparison method. In other words, this says, what is the cost of new construction just like that per square foot? And once we determine that, from there, we're going to subtract away all of our depreciation. Or better yet, we're going to subtract away accrued depreciation. Accrued depreciation is depreciation over time. And there are 3 categories of depreciation. There's physical deterioration, which is ordinary wear and tear. There's functional obsolescence, which is a design problem, such as a 3-bedroom, 1-bath home. That has a design problem. And the last thing is the external obsolescence. External obsolescence is something that's outside the boundary of the subject property that makes it lose value. And typically speaking, your external obsolescence is always incurable. Now, what's the difference between curable and incurable? Anytime that you can repair or add something to a home and you can make money doing it, that's curable. Anytime that you add or repair something to a home and you can't get your money back, that's considered to be incurable. And oftentimes what we look at is a property's economic life and effective age. The economic life is how long it's supposed to last if no maintenance is done. The effective age is how old it looks. And all we're doing is comparing those 2 things. The effective age is basically the amount of depreciation that has occurred. Also, let me make this comment about the cost depreciation approach. It is that approach where we're separating the building from the land. We apply the cost approach only to the building. Take care of any depreciation that's in there. Only the building is going to depreciate. Once we've figured out the depreciation and what the depreciated value of the building is, then we add the land back into it, and that gives us the value of the depreciated property itself. The last approach to value that the appraiser is going to use, if at all possible, is called the income approach. And there's actually 2 methods to the income approach. The first one is the income capitalization approach. This is the one that is based on the principle of anticipation. In other words, a property is generating income today, we expect it to produce income in the future as well. The best way to get down to where we need to be with the income approach is basically taking a net operating income and dividing it by some cap rate. I like to call it a formula. Some people argue with me and say it's not a formula. I over RV. IRV, I call it the IRV formula. Income is net operating income. The R is the capitalization rate, and the V is value. In any problem that you're given, you'll always be given 2 to find the third. So if they give you income and rate, you can find the value. Remember that when numbers are on top of each other, you divide the top number by the bottom. When numbers are next to each other, you multiply. So how do we get down to net operating income? The very first thing that we want to do is determine a property's potential gross income. And we calculate potential gross income in 2 ways. Either contract rent or market rent. Contract rent is when you have a long-term tenant under contract, like IBM for 10 years. You got to go by their contracts because those contracts aren't going to go away. But if you don't have a long-term tenant like IBM, then what we're going to do is go by market rent. Market rent are comparables. What's everybody else getting that have rental units like yours? Once we've determined the potential gross income, we're going to subtract out vacancy and collection losses. Vacancy and collection losses are for those folks that aren't there or that are not paying. They can't contribute. And that will leave us something called effective gross income. Effective gross income is the real money that we have to pay our bills with. Now, what bills do we have? We call these operating expenses. Those operating expenses are made up in 3 categories. Your fixed expenses, which are your taxes and insurance. Your variable expenses, which are maintenance and management and utilities. And then we kick out a little reserve for requirement. In other words, we set money aside to pay for things that break later on. Those 3 are your categories for operating expenses. Notice that my mortgage payment, which is also known as debt service, is not considered an operating expense. It's separate and apart. Once we subtract out our operating expenses, that leaves us something called net operating income. It's the net operating income that the appraiser uses to determine the value. You take the net operating income and divide it by the capitalization rate or the cap rate, and that gives you the value of the property. The other approach to value that the appraiser may use is called the gross rent multiplier. Now that formula is what I call my Vroom formula. V over RM. Value at the top, rent, and multiplier on the bottom. Once again, if you know 2, you can find the third. So if I'm looking for the value, the V at the top, if I know what the rents are in the market, and if I know what the average multiplier is in the market, I can multiply that multiplier by the rent, and that'll tell me what that property is worth. The gross rent multiplier. It's basically gross monthly rent. It doesn't take into account operating expenses. Let me also say that you may see a problem that has to do with the gross income multiplier. The gross income multiplier is an annual calculation and not a monthly calculation. And let's don't confuse the gross income multiplier with the IRV formula. The income capitalization rate is also an annual calculation. But the gross income multiplier is where you're using seasonal rental properties, such as the beach area, where during the summertime you may get one rent, the wintertime you may get another rent, so rents are not consistent. So what we want to do is lump them all into one annual rent. The formula is still the same, V over RM. As far as the CMA is concerned, this is the comparative market analysis. With the CMA, the real estate agent is going to be looking at 3 different components, unlike the appraisal. Remember that a licensee can do a CMA. And we could do it for a fee if we wanted to, but most of us don't. Most of us do it as a service. The 3 things that we're looking at, we want to first of all look at properties that have recently sold. That tells us what our property should sell for. Secondly, we're going to look at what our competition is. In other words, what's currently on the market, because we don't want to be above our competition. And then thirdly, we're going to look at those properties that have expired. And let me tell you what that means. Anytime that a property has expired from the MLS system or the multiple listing system, if it's gone 6 months or a year and hasn't sold yet, it was overpriced. And so we look at that and say, that's where we don't want to be. We don't want to be out there where it's overpriced and never will sell. And let me say this, folks. Buyers are not going to pay more than what they want to pay for a property. You can't make them. So I always have told people that the key to real estate and what the true test of value is what somebody's willing to pay for it. That's the bottom line. And that pretty much takes care of our Chapter 11 appraisal section. And what I'd like to do right now is to do a quick review of the appraisal section with you. As far as appraising is concerned, appraisals can only be done by individuals that are state certified. Real estate licensees can prepare CMAs, or the comparative market analysis. Market value is what the normal buyer under normal conditions would be willing to pay for a property. Cost is the actual amount spent to buy or to create a property. Cost, price, and value may or may not be the same. The comparable sales approach, remember Robin Hood, take from the rich and give to the poor. The cost depreciation approach, we use that when we're dealing with special purpose buildings. The income approach is simply taking the net operating income and dividing it by a cap rate to come up with value. And remember, it's based on the principle of anticipation. Assemblage is combining properties together under one ownership. Plottage is making the property go up in value because of assemblage. The comparative market analysis consists of sold properties, properties that are currently on the market, and properties that have expired. The principle of substitution sets the upper limits of value. Land is typically valued using the comparable sales approach. The gross rent multiplier is rent times the multiplier gives you value. The income approach is your net income divided by a cap rate, which gives you value. Remember, gross income minus vacancy and collection losses gives you effective gross income, minus your operating expenses gives you net operating income. And it's the net operating income that we use to determine value in the IRV, or the income capitalization approach. And that's the end of Chapter 11 summary.